Hello, this is Jacob Barge, and today we're going to be covering Engineers Without Borders USA, the kind of problems that they solve, how they aim to solve them, and ultimately why one should consider donating to Engineers Without Borders when donating to a nonprofit. I've done some research on this organization, I've had some first-hand experience with them. All around, I've been very impressed with them and very interested by their work. Hopefully you find it just as interesting as I have. So let's get started with some basics. First off, they were founded in 2002 in Colorado, and their goal is to provide basic human needs, and that can be a lot of things, and we'll go over some of those on the next slide. Since their founding, they've had over 16,000 volunteers, and they've served in over 46 countries, but are currently in 46 countries at the time of this recording, which is July 2018. And that includes 2 continents. That's both Africa and South America. So moving on, as promised, we're going to talk about some of the problems that Engineers Without Borders sees and solves. What they think is important and why, and right now the distribution of what they do. As you can see, the vast majority of Engineers Without Borders projects focus on water supply, 62%. These numbers are from 2015, so I'm sure they've shifted around a little bit, but generally they're pretty indicative of what Engineers Without Borders does. Working our way down, we have a tie for second in structural and agricultural projects, and that could be bridges as a good example for structural, and farming techniques is a good example of agricultural. Then we have sanitation, civil works. People tend to not know what that is so much. That could be a road, a staircase, just anything that's vital to a community, making it safe for them to get from point A to point B, or otherwise just serving the public good. And then down there at 4% we have energy, and this is a new topic, and it's starting to become more and more of a basic human need. People need to communicate electronically for economical reasons, but also for healthcare reasons in order to receive adequate medical care in case of emergency. Energy is a big deal there, and a lot of the new technology that aids these countries in thriving and being viable communities are electricity based. So engineering is becoming an emerging issue that Engineers Without Borders definitely has their eye on. So, as all problems do, these problems ask the question, well, what do we do about them? And before we get into that, let's just consider the type of problems that Engineers Without Borders has been having and some of the characteristics that they display. The first I want to talk about is scope. These are big issues. Water quality is a lot of what they do, and as you know, it can't be solved in a day. It's very widespread. It has a lot of causes and a lot of effects, and so it's a difficult thing to tackle just because it's so large. Secondly, the impact. This is not an isolated issue. None of the issues are isolated. They're very widespread, and that's why Engineers Without Borders finds themselves in over 45 countries in efforts to solve all these problems, just because the impact of these issues is so widespread. Third is the complexity of the issues, and complexity kind of goes hand in hand with all of these, but here I'm talking specifically about technical complexity. Actually solving these issues requires a high level of technical understanding of the engineering field, which we'll get to in a moment. And then fourth is the resources. Not just the resources that the community lacks, but also the resources that nonprofits have to expend in solving these issues. So that brings us to the next point, which is, well, we know a problem and we know some characteristics about the problem, so what do we do about it? Who do we turn to? How do we solve it? And the solution that Engineers Without Borders has proposed is civil engineering and engineering in general. I have here a quote taken from the Code of Ethics put out by the National Society of Professional Engineers, and this is literally rule number 1. Engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. And I think this is a good indicator of the fact that engineers train for these problems. They train to preserve and protect the safety, health, and welfare of the public, and that's why they do such a good job solving these problems. Their field really lends themselves to solving these issues abroad and domestically. There are a lot of organizations to consider donating to, and they each have their own factors, their own characteristics that should be considered. These are a few that I think set EWB apart from the crowd in that regard, and we're going to go over those real quick. The first is impactful and lasting results, with an emphasis on the and lasting. Lots of organizations provide impactful results, and those are good, but what sets this organization apart is the lasting part of those results. They really believe in the teach a man to fish philosophy, that it's better to give someone access to something than to just give it to them. Water quality and water supply is a really good example of this. Lots of organizations provide bottled water to communities in need, and that's a good thing, and that's to be commended. But what Engineers Without Borders does that's different is that instead of providing water bottles, they provide a water supply that will give communities the access to the water they need to thrive, to farm, to feed their livestock or animals and their families for an indefinite period of time. And that's a huge difference for me. The second is the focus on culture. They understand that there's a cultural aspect to aid that needs to be considered, that the culture that exists in a community needs to be respected for a community to truly be changed for the better. They do a good job of understanding before they start change, and it's made a huge difference in a lot of their efforts. Third is frugality. For the scope and the size of Engineers Without Borders, for the technical complexity of the work that they do. According to Forbes' top 100 list of nonprofit organizations ranked by charitable donations received, Engineers Without Borders doesn't even rank in the top 100. And I think that's very impressive considering the scope and the level of work they perform and the amount of resources required to perform that work. Fourth is double investment, and this requires some explaining, but I've heard some concerns before about people wanting to give to international nonprofits, but are hesitant because they see problems in their own communities that they would rather solve first. And that's very honorable. And the special thing about this organization is when you invest into it, you are actually investing into both. And the reason being is that the communities receive their basic human needs, but the young engineers and the engineers in practice that solve these problems are getting new perspectives, they're getting new expertise, experience, they're discovering new solutions to problems that we have here. And they bring those experiences, they bring that new knowledge back with them when they solve these issues. And so you're not just funding the basic human needs, you're also funding the engineering base that protects the safety, health, and welfare of the public in America. And that's a big deal. Fifth is community involvement. Beyond just understanding the culture, a lot of what they do is taking the time to get involved in the community and getting the community involved with them. This way that there's no us and them mentality. The community doesn't feel any separation or foreignness to interacting with the engineers, and this lends higher success rates to the projects because the community is willing to accept aid, and they're willing to receive instruction and education from the engineers that travel to these communities, and they're willing to invest themselves into the programs and the systems that are being implemented, and we'll get to that more in the next slide. Before we get to the main talking point, I want to let's just go over what some of the numbers mean real quick, simplify this information a little bit. 126 reviewed projects means that there are these statistics come from a sample size of 126, and those are all communities that have had the benefit of receiving a system that solves a water supply problem from Engineers Without Borders. EWB has gone back to these communities, these 126, to check on them, to collect data and information, and what they're looking for is that lasting effect that I talked about earlier. They really care about that, and that's a good metric of success for them. Secondly, that 82% highly functional, that's a really high number for engineering projects. They're very technical, so 82 is a good digit there. There's always room for improvement, but overall, very good. And that just means that when they hand the product to the community and implement it, it works. It serves its purpose, whether that's clean water, transportation, sanitation, energy, whatever it may be, it works, and it works well. What I really want to talk about and what I've been trying to get to is this 81% maintained by community. And the amazing thing about this is 81% is 98.7% of 82%. And just to make that really simple, what that means is of the projects that work, almost 99% of those have been maintained by the community. Not by the engineers and not by the government, by the community. Because when EWB leaves an area, they leave behind this system, they leave behind a solution, but it's up to the community, it's up to the people there to maintain it, to give their resources, their time, their money, their labor, to making sure the system remains operational. And this is something I love to bring up because it shows you just how much the community is actually involved in this process. How much they're involved and how much they care, how invested they are, and how much they see the importance in the work that Engineers Without Borders is doing in their own community. They're willing to sacrifice their own resources for these projects, and that's a really amazing thing. So that being said, these are the works that I have referenced in this presentation. The infographic is included in there. The statistics are included in there. From the Engineers Without Borders, we have the Code of Ethics. So if you guys want to take a look at that, those are all great sources. And after all that, I just want to thank you for your time. I hope that this has been informative for you, that it's been interesting. And certainly, researching this organization has been very interesting and informative for myself. I think the impact they have abroad is vast and it's very positive, and I think they are definitely an organization that deserves considering when making a donation or a consideration of any kind. If you'd like to donate, or if you'd just like to learn more about the organization and what they do and where they do it and how they do it, feel free to check them out at ewb-usa.org. There's a lot of cool information in there, and I encourage you to go take a look for yourself. Thank you again for your time.